Okay, so you ready to dive into this whole herpes transmission thing?
Let's do it. I've got my myth-busting boots on.
Love it. Our listeners sent in a ton of stuff on this. Research papers, personal stories. We even got some CDC data in the mix. Looks like they want to get this right.
Well, and they should. It's important. And let's be real, herpes is one of those topics that people tend to avoid talking about.
It's like the whispered secret of the health class.
Yeah,
Everyone heard something about it, but no one really remembers what.
exactly. And that lack of good information, well, it creates a breeding ground for myths and misinformation.
Oh, tell me about it. Just the other day, I was uh, I was talking to a friend, and they were convinced they got herpes from like a mislabeled lab sample, like years ago. I was like, dude, what?
Yeah. Oh, I've heard it all. But, here's a fact that might make you and your friend feel a little less alone globally. Over 80% of adults have some form of herpes.
80%. Okay, see, this is why we're doing this.
Yeah.
So let's ditch the mystery and get right to it. You sent in this incredible document called How to Lower Transmission Risk to Partners,
Mhm.
which, side note, I think that should be the title of my dating memoir. But anyway, it is jam-packed with stuff we need to unpack.
It really is. And just to be clear, we'll be talking about both HSV1, so that's the one usually associated with oral herpes, and HSV2, which we typically think of as genital herpes.
The dynamic duo.
Exactly. But the thing is, a lot of these myths, they apply to both.
Okay, so myth number one, and I'll admit, I totally used to think this. You can only get herpes if someone has a visible outbreak. Like, no sores, no problem. Right.
Ugh, if only it were that simple. It's kind of like thinking a volcano is only dangerous when it's erupting.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
So even when you don't see those telltale signs, the virus can still be active and transmittable. It's what we call asymptomatic shedding.
Okay, hold up. Asymptomatic shedding. That sounds kind of intense. Can we break that down a bit, maybe for those of us who aren't fluent in virus speak?
Sure, imagine the virus as like these tiny invisible ninjas, right? Sometimes they're hiding out in your system, not causing any trouble. That's when you have no symptoms. But every now and then, those ninjas come out to play, even if you can't see them. And when they're out, that's when transmission can occur.
Sneaky little ninjas. So even if you feel fine, you could still unknowingly pass it on. That's kind of huge. Does that mean, though, like if you have herpes, you're always contagious? Asking for a friend, obviously.
No, not always. Remember, those viral ninjas, they're only out and about some of the time. It's not constant.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring. But what about, and I swear I saw this on a bathroom stall once, that you can get herpes from a toilet seat? Is that like even remotely possible?
Nope. Let's put that myth to rest right now. Herpes is spread through direct skin-to-skin contact. So toilet seats, towels, sharing utensils, none of those can transmit herpes.
Okay, good to know. We can all breathe a sigh of relief during bathroom breaks. But what if, say, you've never even had an outbreak yourself? Can you still, I don't know, pass it on?
That's the thing about those sneaky ninjas. Even without ever having symptoms, you can still shed the virus. It might happen less often than someone who's having an outbreak, but it can still happen.
Invisible doesn't mean inert. Got it. Okay, let's talk protection then, because I think we're all thinking of condoms. They pretty much make you invincible, right?
I wish it were that simple. Condoms are definitely crucial for safer sex, and they do significantly lower the risk. But foolproof? Not so much. In fact, one of the personal stories you sent in actually highlighted this. They said they had outbreaks outside the area a condom covers, which.
Okay, visual not needed, but point taken. Condoms are great, but not a 100% guarantee, which is why communication is key.
100%. Being open and honest with your partner about your sexual health, including herpes, is so important. It's about building that trust and making those responsible choices together.
Preach. Okay, time for a real talk moment. If you happen to, sleep with someone who has herpes, does that mean you're guaranteed to get it? Because that feels like a myth that just won't quit.
And it's a myth worth busting, for sure. Honestly, someone who knows their status, understands transmission, and takes proactive steps is likely a safer partner than someone who's in the dark about their own health.
Right. Knowledge is power. For real. Speaking of power, what about antivirals? Can those little pills actually make a difference in transmission? All right, so back to those little power pills for a sec. You mentioned antivirals, but how much of a difference do they really make when we were talking actual transmission rates?
It's actually pretty significant. One study you sent in showed that taking a daily antiviral, so we're talking acyclovir, famciclovir, or valacyclovir, it could cut your chances of passing on HSV2 by up to 50%.
50%. Okay, see, this is why I love these deep dives. Always learning.
Exactly. Knowledge is power.
Speaking of, what about oral sex? That feels like a whole other can of worms. There's this idea that if you have herpes, oral sex is totally off limits.
Yeah, that's definitely a myth I hear a lot, and it's not quite that straightforward.
So what's the real deal? Safe or not?
It really depends. Which type of herpes we're talking about is a big one. Like with HSV1, the one that usually hangs out in the oral region, transmission from genitals to mouth. It's less common.
Less common, but still possible.
Right, and the risk goes up if there's an active oral outbreak. Basically, HSV1 sheds more from the mouth, making it more likely to go from mouth to genitals rather than genitals to mouth.
Okay, so location, location, location. Got it.
Yeah.
What about HSV2 then?
Oral HSV2, so having it in the mouth is pretty rare. HSV2 tends to prefer the area around the base of the spine, whereas HSV1 is usually found near the neck.
Makes sense. So while we're on the topic of what you can't get herpes from, I have to ask about all those other things people freak out about: sharing drinks, using someone's towel. I even heard a rumor about a swimming pool once.
Okay, so we're talking myths 9 through 11, all in one go. Herpes just isn't that easily transmittable. You can't get it from surfaces, objects, or even water.
So all those horror stories about inanimate objects are just that stories.
Exactly. And while we're debunking, let's talk blood transmission. Myth number 12 claims you can get herpes from blood.
Wait, really? But don't they test for it through blood tests?
They do, but they're testing for antibodies, not the virus itself. Herpes doesn't actually live in your bloodstream. You can even donate blood if you have herpes.
Wow. See the things you learn. What about saliva, though? Is swapping spit a no-go?
Myth number 13 busted. While we can detect herpes in saliva, it's not in high enough quantities to actually transmit the virus through saliva alone. Now, kissing is different because you've got that skin-to-skin contact happening, but saliva by itself, you're fine.
Good to know. Okay, what about, like, giving yourself herpes in a different spot? Like, if you touch an outbreak, then touch somewhere else on your body.
Okay, so that's myth 14, and it is technically possible, but it's pretty rare, especially once you've had herpes for a while. You see, your body actually builds up antibodies that make it harder to get it again, even from yourself.
Our bodies are smarter than we think sometimes. Okay, so let's talk transmission rates between partners.
Yeah.
Specifically that it's the same, whether it's male to female or female to male.
Myth 15 busted. Anatomically speaking, transmission is more likely to happen from penis to vagina.
Right, because of those ninjas needing an entry point.
Exactly. Okay, before we wrap up this myth-busting extravaganza, we have to talk hygiene. Because myth 16 always stresses me out a little. It says you need to use all these intense products to kill herpes on surfaces, clothes, even your own skin.
Yeah, no thank you.
Right. Thankfully, that's another one we can toss out. Remember how we talked about herpes being a weak virus outside the body? Plain old soap and water do the trick.
No need for the hazmat suit then.
Nope, regular hygiene wins again. Speaking of which, myth number 17 likes to pop up around kids.
Oh, right, that you have to be extra careful around children or you'll definitely pass it on.
And I'm happy to say it's largely a myth. Genital herpes is not easily passed on through casual contact. You don't have to avoid hugging, cuddling, or even sharing a bath with the child. It goes back to those ninjas needing direct skin-to-skin contact with the affected area.
So no need to treat parents with herpes like they're, carrying the plague.
Exactly. Now, if a parent has an active oral herpes outbreak, it's best to avoid kissing the baby until it clears up, just to be safe. But normal, everyday interactions are totally fine.
That makes sense. What about during pregnancy, though? There's this idea out there that if you have genital herpes, a natural birth is out of the question.
Myth number 18 busted. While every pregnancy has risks, having genital herpes doesn't automatically equal a C-section. In fact, transmission to babies during birth is rare.
So parents to be out there, if you have herpes, best thing to do, talk to your doctor, get informed. You have options.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, last myth on our list, and it's a big one, myth 19 claims that herpes is genetic, like passed down through families.
And that is a big fat false. Herpes is caused by a virus, not your genes.
So no need to start blaming your Uncle Bob for that cold sore.
Nope, you can blame those sneaky little ninjas instead.
Well, we have officially busted a whole lot of myths today. I feel way more informed already. But myths are one thing, Understanding those real-life transmission rates, that feels like a whole other beast, right? Okay, so real talk about these transmission rates. It seems like every website has a different percentage. It's overwhelming. Can we even make sense of it?
I hear you. It can definitely be confusing. And to be honest, transmission rates, they're super tricky to pin down.
And why is that?
Well, you have to remember that shedding patterns, they can vary a lot from person to person, even from day to day.
Right, right, of course.
So those charts we included in the sources, think of those as estimations, not like guarantees.
Estimations, got it. Okay, so if we can't get hung up on specific numbers, then what can we focus on to really get a handle on transmission risk?
I think the best approach is to focus on the factors we know make a difference, like whether someone is having symptoms or not. Huge.
Makes sense.
Symptomatic transmission is usually higher. And when we're talking genitals specifically, well, it's more likely to go from male to female than female to male.
Anatomy 101, we've got those entry points to consider.
Exactly.
What about condoms, though? How much of a difference do they actually make in those transmission rates?
Okay, so condoms definitely help. They create a barrier, which is never a bad thing.
Right.
In fact, one of the charts suggested that consistent condom use can reduce the chance of transmission by about 30%. But, as we already discussed, they're not foolproof.
Right, because those outbreaks, they can be sneaky, popping up in places condoms don't cover.
Exactly. Okay, now what about medication? We talked to how those antivirals can help reduce shedding, but how does that translate into, like, real-life risk reduction?
Yeah, give us the details.
Okay, so one source claimed that if you're on daily suppressive therapy, using those antivirals we talked about, a cyclover, famciclovir, valacyclovir, that could potentially reduce transmission by up to 50%.
Wow, 50%.
Yeah, it's going to make a big difference.
That's amazing. It's so great to have that kind of knowledge. So we've talked about the myths, the realities of transmission rates, even busted some myths about blood and saliva. But let's shift gears a bit. Knowing all this stuff is great, but what can you actually do to protect your partners?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
And the good news is there are concrete things you can do. And honestly, the most important one is also the simplest. Talk to your partners.
Easier said than done sometimes.
Oh, 100%. It can be awkward, it can be scary, but that open and honest communication is absolutely key. And beyond those conversations, understanding your own body is huge.
Like knowing your triggers. Those things that seem to bring on an outboard for you specifically.
Exactly. Stress, lack of sleep, even something like your period. One source actually even included a really interesting list of supplements that could help manage those triggers more naturally. And this is where it gets proactive learning to recognize the signs of an outbreak before it fully happens.
So those prodrome symptoms everyone's talking about.
Yes, those early warning signs, think of them as little whispers from your body like, hey, something's up.
I like that.
Right. Our sources describe them as tingling, itching, even this kind of strange nerve pain in the lower back and legs. It can be super subtle. So paying attention to those little cues, key.
Okay, so we've got open communication, being self-aware, and learning those early warning signs. What else can people do to minimize transmission risk?
Be proactive. Don't wait for an outbreak to happen. Talk to your doctor about suppressive therapy, those antivirals we discussed. Use condoms consistently. And if you're feeling unsure, if something feels off, it's always wise to consider, maybe taking a break from sexual activity until you're feeling more confident.
It's about making those responsible choices.
Yeah.
For yourself and for your partner. On that note, having herpes doesn't mean the end of your sex life.
Absolutely not. It might mean some adjustments, more open communication, maybe a deeper understanding of your own body. But intimacy, it's still very much on the table.
It's a journey.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive with a final thought for you to ponder. How can we, as a society, create a more open and informed conversation about herpes? Reducing that shame, empowering people to make those responsible choices. Don't forget to check out our show notes for links to all the sources we explored. And if you found this deep dive helpful, why not share it? You never know who needs to hear it. Until next time, stay curious.